It's my feel-good breakfast show.
Welcome back. Thank you so much for locking in this morning. We are commemorating Youth Day and celebrating the future of our South African youth. Remember the impact the youth have had in achieving equality and justice in South Africa. But has the significance of Youth Day changed or evolved? I hope it has since the events of 1996. Krishnae Julius, Head of Archives from District 6 Museum, is a custodian of these facts, but also a critical thinker on how we need to use this information. So thank you so much for joining us once again. I can feel my little brain wants to explode with about 1 million questions every time you sit here because there are so many opportunities, it feels like now, for the youth that didn't exist. What does this June the 16th opportunity represent for you now?
I think it's about accountability in terms of the present government, in terms of the people that are in positions of power. So it's about remembering what happened on 16th of June, 1966.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. But it's definitely about accountability and creating the platforms for that kind of accountability.
I think people miss the boat when accountability is seen as a punitive measure. It's not that. It's about taking responsibility so we can move forward, so the system can change, because it's horrifying to me that while the emotional context has changed, the system is still exactly the same. And that's keeping a section of society and a lot of young people, 70% of our young people, immobile. Can you remember that time? Can you remember that feeling of what was created? You've been able to plug into some of the greatest minds, some of those that were literally in that coalface at that time. How has that changed to where the youth are now today? Could you imagine something like that happening today? And how would that look?
I think that could happen today, and it would happen much more quickly. So the way people actually heard about the 16th of June was a few days later. Nobody heard about 16th of June on the 16th of June. And so what it really did was spark what was already organizers in high schools, in schools at the time. And you had student leadership in place at the time. And when 16th of June happened, things just started happening nationwide as well, a few days later. I think today, the power of technology, the power of having access to information it's at our fingertips. And I think that you find a lot of young people use that to actually mobilize immediately. So issues, you don't hear about them a few days later.
As it's happening, you're watching it live.
As it's happening, it's unfolding.
And it feels like that's happening within legislation. That feels like it's happening within commerce. We were talking off camera about how energy has changed the game slightly, but it feels like there are more opportunities now than ever before for young people to steer their own course. How do we set that narrative now when we need to? Because in our media space, there's a vacuum to be filled with negative press, and we love it. How do we change that narrative? How do we inspire young South Africans to have the same level of motivation that they did in 1976?
I think as an older generation, our task is to listen, and to listen with empathy to what makes young people angry, to what disappoints them. And I think really the narrative needs to be set by them. They know what is happening in their communities. They know what their struggles are today. They know what's holding them back. And so I think our role is to build with them and to listen to them.
And there are solutions. Every day, as pessimistic as I want to be because the world feels so polarized, I'm meeting incredible young people, some of them you'll meet today on the couch in the green room, that are blowing our minds with this lack of confinement or barriers. It feels like a completely different reality. That being said, we still need traction and we need action in critical areas in South Africa. Gender-based violence, critical area. Early childhood development, critical for our long-term social development. For you, what are those key focal points? If you had to, in your heart of hearts, launch a mission today, what would that look like?
Well, that's almost putting me
let's chat for a week, yeah.
But I think it's just about critical thinking about what democracy is. It almost feels, it's not something maybe practical. It's not about, fighting around the struggles of housing, social justice. But I think what we need to build are critical thinkers, and help our young people become critical thinkers, because that is the building block for holding democratic processes in place and accountable.
And it's amazing that critical thinking is becoming the common thread across sectors. So you're seeing, as a young person working in technology, you might hold the key for social development. These overlaps are where the really exciting times are. How do we make it understandable? How do we get the emotion across of what this country has experienced with a generation that doesn't have that direct connection? And we use the term lest we forget. But how important is it to keep this conversation alive, for us to remember what actually happened? And how do we keep that connection with a young generation that is moving a million miles an hour in a different direction?
I think connecting with young people and using the languages and modes that they speak, I think that's really important in opening up a conversation. So we're no longer the 1970s and the 1980s. Young people listen differently. They see things differently. And I think as a resource, we are the resources right now. So we are able to show them what we did to mobilize mass protests in the 1970s and 80s, and they are sort of elevating that. And I think that is the intergenerational learning and skills and spaces we must hold through our museums, through our public programming, and also just creating public holidays as forums for accountability and not necessarily parties all the time.
For sure. No, exactly, because it's not something to celebrate. We can celebrate when we look forward and we can take account of the gains, and there haven't been a huge amount of gains. So what do you want to say on Youth Day to young South Africans that aren't feeling motivated, that maybe feel like that future isn't there for them? In your experience of seeing the mettle and the fortitude and the strength of character that requires us to transcend this, what do you have to say to young people on this Youth Day?
So I think that for me, it's about finding mentors within one's community. I think sometimes because young people are in situations where they need to sort of be socially, economically, they need to move up, right?
Yeah.
But I think we need to look towards our communities. We need to look at people who hold important lessons around how we live with care, with honesty, with respect. And we need to sort of listen to them, and we need to sort of adapt that for the future as well.
Completely, because we've reached a singularity, the past, the future, all coming together very, very effectively in the now. You can act now like never before. We have tools to communicate these messages like never before. But what I'm loving the most is we've got a generation of young people that are more motivated than I've ever seen before, and it's all on you. So thank you, and I hope you're going to find a future reason to celebrate Youth Day today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we absolutely love having you in studio. We might ask you to stick around for a few more hours so we can keep plugging into this, but keep those Youth Day messages coming on all of our socials.